Space Mobile Podcast.
We just basically turn their phone and be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Listen, the opportunity that we have is very, very, very large.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this ad hoc space. I just decided to fire this up because I wanted to cover this topic that, quite frankly, I didn't really prepare anything, but I've just been having some conversations with various people, Kook, Tut, and others, and I just figured might be good to just cover this topic because I think it is something that if you had asked me a few months ago if it was possible or if it made any sense, I would have kind of dismissed it. But then I think fast forward to today where we are, and given the nature and state of how US government is looking at what industries are strategic and, you know, what areas they want to foster and protect and grow. I think this whole idea of government potentially taking stakes in some of these newer space companies actually makes quite a bit of sense, especially in the context of future awards around defense contracts and especially Golden Dome, and just given the time frame that actually needs to happen. So yeah, I wanted to have a space and just discuss it briefly. I'm not planning to do a 2-hour space again. And also I encourage people, if you have questions or even if you want to come up at some point, maybe we can have more of an interactive discussion. But yeah, what a week, right? I think Kook covered this quite a bit yesterday evening, but you know, given where the markets are right now relative to where we were Friday after the close, which, you know, we had obviously AST, sorry, Bloomberg squawk going off. Let me turn this off. But yeah, AST Space Mobile, obviously we were all very excited about the Bluebird 6, which now we know is the only satellite that's on the Antonov, which got picked up over the weekend and it's on its way to India. Bluebird 7, from what we can tell, I think it's pretty close to being done, and that will be on a flatbed truck out to Cape Canaveral. I'm sure we'll get a PR at some point, or maybe perhaps some of the sleuths out there might be able to figure out when that actually ships. But yeah, it's an exciting time. We're on the cusp of launching multiple satellites with the view towards commercial service in 2026. And so yeah, it's a exciting time to be an investor. I will just point out how amazing this community is. I was thinking about it before I went to bed last night, how when I worked at a hedge fund, there would have been no way that I would have been able to gather the amount of due diligence and intelligence that this community brings. And the reason why it came up to mind is that there was, you know, there's clearly a ton of people who own AST Space Mobile out there, some who are quite vocal, some who are silent. But last night, someone had talked about how the Antonov had disappeared from flight tracking after landing in Alaska. And then a shareholder came forward on Twitter and said, oh yeah, you know, usually they turn the transponder off when they're parked and the crew might be, you know, before a very long, all day of flying, before a long flight ahead of them, they might actually, you know, bed for the evening in that particular city. And so you will have flight trackers that are off. And then I think someone asked this person, this, who I understand is a stay-at-home mom now, you know, what gave them this view. And then this mother said, well, I used to fly air cargo all over the world. And so this is just part of like normal operating procedure. And of course, this person also owns shares of AST Space Mobile. So that's kind of the cool aspect of this community. The level of due diligence and the knowledge base is just so deep. And so, you know, whether that's people who are showing up at in New Hampshire or Dallas-Fort Worth or Alaska, or of course Midland, taking pictures of the plane as it lands and gets loaded and takes off again. It's just, yeah, it's unparalleled how much brain power we have in this community. So just wanted to point that out. But yeah, so Friday, the reason why I mentioned Friday is that we're obviously this potential Trump tariff war with China, that got the market on edge. Unfortunately for people who were invested in crypto, which I didn't fully understand why the drawdown was so bad for people. But then as more stories came out of people getting liquidated, and we could do a whole entire separate Twitter space on that. But it sounds like people were leveraged up to 50 times or 30 times on perpetual ETH futures, which is a crazy thing to do given the underlying vol of the assets that you're leveraging. But yeah, with the tariff news obviously sending markets down, we saw ASD Space Mobile trade down to as low as 75, 76. Perhaps there were people who were margined who were selling, but then probably short sellers who thought they were being smart and shorting the whole. Not looking so smart today. But as part of that tariff war, there's that caused a renewed focus on the strategically important industries. And so whether that's rare earths like MP, USAR, and TMQ, any number of these names. So that's just like, that's the inputs, LAC, lithium. That's just the inputs. But then I think kind of playing that forward, the government. So the government is clearly trying to foster these sectors that are where, for example, rare earths were heavily reliant on China or other countries or regions that are unstable. And so what the U.S. is trying to do is help foster what development of these resources either domestically or in areas that are friendly to the U.S. And by doing so, by taking economic stakes in these companies, whether I think in MP they actually put in money and got, I believe it was a 10% stake back, and then of course shortly after that, and this is when the stock was I think under 30, but Apple entered into a strategic supply agreement, invested money as well, and then MP went from I think it was the 20s to where it is today, which is almost 100. But the key thing that the U.S. government is doing here is that they're trying to help foster these areas that they think are strategic, and they may not be economically viable today, or they have a lot of risk, but typically for an area that is highly strategic, that's where you have the government step in, where private investors may not want to take the risk, but the U.S. government comes in and says, hey, this is really important. It's important to national security, so we're going to step in and we're going to take an economic stake. And so what does that mean? So in the case of these uneconomic rare earth mines, they can't produce anything economically, relative to where the market is, and especially competing with China. But with the U.S. taking a stake and the stock prices trading up significantly, that lowers their cost of capital. It also makes the U.S. a de facto kind of backstop for these companies. So if there are troubles ahead, some people talk about moral hazard, like if the U.S. takes stake in these companies, and then what if they do bad things? It'll just teach investors that there is no moral hazard, and people take even more risks, and then bad things can happen. We kind of went through this in the financial crisis in 2008, where, believe it or not, which it was for good reason, but when the financial system was on the brink of collapse, the U.S. government had to step in and force, not by choice, but it forced every bank, regional, large national banks, or pretty much forced every financial services firm to take preferred equity from the U.S. government. The reason why the U.S. did that is, if you guys, for some of you perhaps that were too young, all these financial firms were failing because it was a crisis of confidence. Like back then, when you had all the subprime loans from houses, and all packaged into CLOs, and basically the entire financial system collapsed when these things started unwinding, and of course house values went down. There was essentially a run on all these banks, and so the U.S. government had to step in. Warren Buffett came in, he took a stake in Goldman Sachs, and various people were trying to do deals, but that didn't really stem the bleeding until the U.S. government stepped in and said, we are basically going to act as the financial backstop to all these financial services firms. And so whether you have deposit at Bank of America or, Fargo or hedge fund that has assets at a prime broker, whether that was Morgan Stanley or some other firm, your stuff is safe because we are implicitly backing it by taking a stake. And that's what really stopped the spiral downward in 2008. And of course, back then, there was a Democratic, it was Obama was in power at the time, and Democrats were in favor of this, Republicans were against it because of moral hazard, and we don't want government intervention. But when shit really hit the fan, everybody came together and passed TARP because I remember living through that period of time when the financial system was on the other point of collapse. We really were pretty close to this point where we were going to have to be forced to pay for things with rocks because everything was on the brink of collapse then. The reason why I mentioned that is there is a template for this, right? So you having some level of government intervention, or fast forward to COVID, Project Warp Speed, where whether you believe in vaccines or not, the government decided developing vaccines is pretty important to fight against COVID, and so there was funding and easing of regulatory measures in order to make that happen. And so there was a template for this stuff. I know obviously now people are debating whether it makes sense for the US government to take stakes in some of these rare earth companies, which me personally, I think it makes a ton of sense. I think a lot of these companies, in terms of the risk of developing these mines and of course the regulatory hair that goes along with it. I mean, part of the reason why China is so far ahead in terms of rare earths development is that they have lax regulations, or when the state says like, we're going to do this, and they do it and they just push it through. I think given how critical some of these strategic minerals are to the US, I think we need something similar along those lines. Obviously not putting public safety at jeopardy, but the fact that if the US government can take a stake in one of these companies and really lower their cost of capital, and also get the bureaucrats in Washington to focus on it as an issue to push through these programs from a regulatory perspective, I think that's a net positive. Because I think I'm not a mineral expert or anything, but when it comes to rare earths, it's not really a dearth of digging this stuff out of the ground, but it's actually the process of taking what you take out of the ground and refining it, processing it to the end product, which that process results in waste materials and other things that obviously we got to figure out how to deal with. But yeah, so I personally, just given the nature of our relationship with China, I think it is important for the U.S. to develop and its allies to develop alternative sources for whether it's uranium, lithium, any number, tungsten. I mean, it seems like every day you read about a different mineral that's really important that we don't have, but then the Chinese have. And so I think it's smart for the U.S. To participate in some of these things. I mean, I guess it's kind of funny how you have some politicians who are anti-clean energy, but now they're like all about strategic minerals, when in fact, I think clean energy and strategic minerals are kind of one and the same. I've talked about this a little bit, how people are poo-pooing on solar right now, but if you look at the demand for AI, we're going to need every single drop of energy from every single source for the next 20 years. Otherwise, this is before some of these modular nuclear reactor companies come online and make that a reality. But you're going to need wind. You're going to need the feared, the windmills that President Trump despises. I mean, you're going to need those. You're going to need hydro. You're going to need solar. You need all these things. But anyway, that's a long-winded intro. The reason why I think I've been trying to get smart on all this stuff, and I think taking a step back, if you consider who our biggest adversary is in space and the importance of space, whether that's related to connectivity, future commerce, but then also from a military perspective, our biggest adversaries are Russia and China right now. And Russia, I think, still important. The biggest, I guess, concern about Russia is that they've developed anti-satellite weaponry, and we all know um, if there is some type of exchange or battle in space, the repercussions of that is if things get really heated and you have satellites, it's one thing for satellites to grapple each other and take each other out, but if you actually have weapons that destroy satellites, that would basically shut down space overall, just given the debris that would be out there. You'd have, the Kessler syndrome, as we've all talked about, which is greatly feared. But if there truly is some type of conflict in space, then that would make space unusable, it's important that I think all parties recognize that. And, the benefits of space exploration, having assets in space are obviously, I mean, I don't need to educate everyone here, but that's really important. And I think that outweighs the militarization of space. That said, for defensive purposes, especially here on Earth, space is going to play a huge role. And so when I talk about the government potentially taking stakes, what does that mean? If you look at the large primes, whether that's Lockheed Martin, Boeing, some of these bigger names, those companies by default, they're de facto government sponsored. The reason why I say that is they derive a pretty material, or in some cases, a majority of their revenues from the government, whether that's on the defense or commercial side. But but for all intents and purposes, like, they are supported by the government, and I think people fully understand that. But I think where the potential for the U.S. government to take stakes, and it may not just be an equity stake, but it could be also loans, which, for AST Space Mobile, we've talked about import-export bank loans. That I think the reason why the government might contemplate doing so is that space is a critical vertical, sector that the U.S. government is interested in. It's a contested area, increasingly contested area, where China is looking to dominate. What I mean by that is, if you look at China's launch capability, they're the second best, the second most capable and best launch provider out there, relative, in terms of total tonnage that's sent up to space, second only to SpaceX, and they're continually improving that program. But China's they've already outlined their future, where they're already putting up a fixed wireless competitor to Starlink. And then, as many space mobile investors know, they've already, at least in terms of graphics, they've already developed a almost carbon copy of the Block 1 satellites that they are, who knows like how much of it is vaporware or real, but they've at least made a computer graphic of it. And so reading the Chinese press, they view direct-to-device as a very critical area, high growth. And so I wouldn't, I would just assume that they are going to put up a constellation to compete. And so, is that a concern? I think, importantly, when it comes on the commercial side, there is going to be room on, let's kind of bucket these into two areas. One is the Western world, or allies with the US. I think Starlink and AST Space Mobile will be the two dominant players of that market. And that's going to be a very attractive market. Obviously, the US market is the biggest and most profitable wireless market in the world. And so, currently AST is working with AT&T and Verizon, and then Starlink is working with T-Mobile. But then extending beyond that, for the Western world, you're going to, obviously MNOs are going to pick between one of those two companies. AST has 50 MNOs today, and Starlink now has, I believe, 9, if we count Boost Mobile. And so that's kind of the Western world. Whereas I think China will develop their own constellation, and they'll service countries that are either allied with them or probably more open to, I guess, the potential risks, right? So whether that's Iran, Russia, some North Korea, and then perhaps some developing countries where they might be forced to take the service. As some of you guys probably know, throughout history, or more recent history, China helped develop mineral resources in a lot of African countries, but as part of that, they also forced these countries to take Huawei equipment, for example, or other things, because they, at the end of the day, in exchange for development rights, they basically had to become consumers of Chinese equipment and monitoring, for that matter. Um, but yeah, so this area is highly critical and strategic for the U.S. One, from a commercial standpoint of having global leadership, and I think having AST SpaceMobile and Starlink kind of being the tip of the spear is great, because for all intents and purposes, AST is a leader in technology. Starlink will eventually get there and have a good product too. But I think from a strategic perspective, looking at defense capabilities, AST SpaceMobile has very unique things that it can offer, which we've discussed. Whether I think Scott has publicly disclosed that they see 10 use cases that are non-communication use cases for defense. And so we've seen SDA, DIU, all the armed forces branches, all testing and working with AST SpaceMobile. And then, of course, the big one, which is Golden Dome. Based off of our work, we have reason to believe that AST will be an important, if not critical, piece to Golden Dome. And so therein lies, the potential, I think, for the government to contemplate taking a stake in the company. And the reason why that would make sense, going back to the primes, as I said before, those are large organizations. They get hundreds of millions of dollars from the US government. And they, for all intents and purposes, those are supported and de facto backed by the US government. Whereas I think whether it's AST SpaceMobile, some of these other companies that are kind of newer players, Rocket Lab would fit in that category. Black Sky kind of fits in that category. I mean, Black Sky gets, I think, like over 90% of its revenues from the US government. And so I think they're viewed as grateful. But yeah, so for some of these next generation space companies, which I would argue, depending on their level of involvement in Golden Dome or some of these other defense contracts, I think they're going to be viewed as important to U.S. national security. And so that's why I think the potential for them to get some type of investment from the U.S. or perhaps loans from the U.S., I think is pretty high. So maybe if it was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, again, if you had asked me if this was a possibility, I would have kind of downplayed it. Whereas nowadays, I think it's probably like a 20 to 25% probability that the US could take a stake in AST SpaceMobile. And I know like people have pushed back and said, well, if the US takes an equity stake in SpaceMobile, could that jeopardize some of the work that it's doing around the world with some of these MNOs, perhaps, like, for example, in Europe, AST is working with Vodafone through their satellite joint venture to service Europe. And one of the things that they've touted there is sovereignty. I don't think, from my perspective, so Satco JV is going to be majority owned by Vodafone. AST is going to be a minority owner. And then, of course, you're going to have like other European MNOs join that. And then that entity is going to have control over the assets once, when they're flying over Europe. And so, theoretically, AST is not going to have the ability to tinker around with that. They would, through this governance process, which it depends on how they set it up, but I think it'll be ring fenced from AST, so it will truly have. I mean, AST will have board members, and they will have the ability to help drive decisions, but they're not going to have majority of the board there. And so I think the sovereignty is going to be, from that perspective, would be retained. And when I mentioned earlier, or in the tweet, that a 5 to 10% stake would be passive, it would just be an equity stake, right? Like, I don't think the government would demand a board seat. I mean, they haven't done that for any of these private entities before. But they would just it'd be basically a vote of confidence that this company is important strategically. We're going to take an equity stake because we believe in it. By taking this equity stake, we are, in essence, like, reducing the cost of capital for this company that is so strategic that they're working on Golden Dome and some of these other things for us. And so that's why we are implicitly backing them. And I think that from a US perspective, it's important because if you're relying on some of these emerging companies that are on the cusp of commercialization, the technology is important, but obviously they're not there yet in terms of generating financial they're not generating revenues and cash flows that can support them fully. They still are obviously burning through cash. Perhaps this is a way for the U.S. government to, give a vote of confidence, but then also, lower their cost of capital. I think, and I tweeted about this before. Some people have said, well, why would the company take it? What if why don't they just it's too political. They should just not take it. I don't think the company has a choice, right? Obviously, if you talk to management, they'll probably just kind of talk it down or whatever. But if you're, I guess I'd put it this way: the government, if they decide they're going to take a stake in your company, they're going to make you an offer you can't refuse. What I mean by that is, they're going to say, "Yeah, here's a $1 billion Golden Dome award, and we're going to pay you that, and you're going to be a critical part of this. But in order to participate, we have to take a 5% passive stake in your company. And, we'll I don't know, we'll pay for the shares, we'll pay a premium, whatever. But we need a stake because we want to know what's going on. And we want to make sure that your company is going to succeed. And we need to have this toehold to let the market know that, this basically this company is untouchable. And what I mean by that is, that whether it's Rocket Lab or AST Space Mobile, or you name it, MP, USAR, a lot of these early stage companies or highly risky companies. The short interest in all of them were really high. But once the U.S. government takes a stake in if the U.S. government were to take a 5 to 10% stake in AST Space Mobile, as a short seller, what do? You can't be short. It's if your goal is to drive the company's stock price down, and whether it's creating FUD or there's delays here or whatever, the fact that the government is taking a stake in a company, has done their due diligence. They've talked with all the branches of the armed forces and Space Development Agency that has already conducted testing with Blue Walker 3 and Black Wind satellites, and they're like, hey, these guys have it. We need this technology, so I want you to. They talk to the other bureaucrats. They say we need to take a stake in the company. I just don't know how, if you're short, that's a career-ending move, right? And that's actually kind of what you're seeing today, and maybe perhaps over the last week or so, is as these investment banks put out these lists. I think it was Morgan Stanley the other day, JP Morgan today. Not only are they putting out a list of here's a bunch of strategic stuff that makes sense for the government to go invest in. And by the way, we're going to go plow $10 billion from our own into it as well, because we agree, this stuff is strategic, so we need to own it. And we're going to ride that. That's why I ran this poll earlier today, which is, if we were to, if I'm a risk manager at Millennium or Citadel, and some guy's running a $500 million sleeve of capital, a pod, and they have this 25-year-old analyst who's just hot and heavy that AST Space Mobile, due to satellite production delays, the downside is $10 in the stock. It'll go from 90 to 80 or 75 or whatever. I'm a risk manager. I'm walking in, and I read a report from an investment bank saying, "Oh, space is strategic." Which, by the way, the FCC declared October Space Month, and Donald Trump has talked about how. And, Chair Carr, Senator Cruz, you name it. Everybody is we need to lead space. We cannot let the Chinese win that game, right? We need to be the first to the moon. We need to be the first to Mars. God bless Elon, he's helping in that endeavor. But we need to be leader. And the Trump administration they've made that abundantly clear. And so, if you're a risk manager at Citadel and you walk in and some kid has told his PM, when you should be short $100 million of AST Space Mobile because I think they're going to miss the, launch deadline by a month or two, or maybe they're going to run out of funding in 2 years. You're going to walk in and say, why are we short this thing? Tell me, analyst, what happens if the government takes a 5% stake in this company? Where is the stock going to go? You're going to ask, what's the short interest, which I guess as of today is 42 million shares, depending, I'm not sure how many are related to convert. Maybe it's like 10 million shares by now, but I don't know, 30 million shares. Like the day that the government announces a 5% stake or 10% stake, or they don't even have to announce it. Like, what if Wall Street Journal says, hey, the US government is contemplating potential investments in various space companies? Then, like that day, you will get blown to kingdom come and you will have to cover your shares. And so I think you're starting to see some of that movement where people are kind of thinking more broadly, because as investors, that's what we're supposed to do. Okay, the government has, when the government took a stake in Intel and MP, everybody was like, oh, okay, so maybe these are like one-off things. Obviously, Intel is having issues, but then the government sees, eh, you know, having foundry capacity and obviously R&D around CPUs is important for the U.S. U.S. competitiveness. And so they took a stake there, right? And it's kind of funny because, like, I think the the Trump administration floated some negative stuff about the CEO of Intel because maybe the CEO didn't want to take the investment initially, but then after that, those articles came out and they met. All of a sudden, Intel's like, "Yeah, we'll take the investment," which has been good for Intel, right? The stock is up. The government's made money on it as well, and I do think industries like semiconductors are industries that we should be supporting and investing in. Sometimes people kind of poo-poo and say, well, that's not capitalism. We shouldn't, these industries shouldn't be relying on government funds or backing. But I think it's important, like for some of these areas that are highly critical and are super risky. I don't know if everyone remembers like the whole development for ASML. I mean, you had a number of large semiconductor players get together and make strategic investments to make ASML's lithography, next generation lithography machines a reality, because there was just so much risk involved and capital that no one player, not even the company itself, could take that risk. Like it needed a consortium of large players to go put the capital in order to make that a reality, to basically extend the miniaturization of semiconductors with ultraviolet lights. And so here, I think you can argue the same thing for space, where, AST Space Mobile has been blessed that they're putting up this next generation constellation. It's going to launch commercial service in 2026. But then if the US government views it as strategically critical and important, why wouldn't they just take a 5% stake in exchange for Golden Dome Award and other military work that, by the way, the company already has 6 military contracts, and those, Scott has been very open about those expanding from smallish size to then hundreds of millions in size, or the potential for that. If this company is that strategic to the U.S. government, then to me, it's almost a no-brainer. Obviously I'm not in government and I don't know what they're thinking, but some might argue, well, why doesn't the U.S. government do that with Starlink and SpaceX? Well, the U.S. government or SpaceX is by default already U.S. backed. I mean, that's how SpaceX became so successful, and that they won all this U.S. government business, and they obviously, whether that's through Starlink, but also their Star Shield program, they already get a lot of awards, and so they're kind of already past max Q, where from a commercial perspective, they're doing just fine. But I think for some of these smaller companies that have tremendous strategic importance to the U.S., and what I mean by that is not just the military aspects, but also communications. I mean, if you imagine a world where, and today we saw, I think Vodafone had a blackout on its network in the UK. Once AST Space Mobile is up and running, AST satellites will be able to light up that spectrum and bring service back on during the pendency of Vodafone and fixing their network to get it back up. And so in the US, if a bad actor were to try to take down parts of our network, which, by the way, I don't know if you guys saw the news, but there was like, I think when the UN met, maybe it was a month ago, they actually caught these guys who were planning to overload the cell networks in in New York City. For what purpose, I'm not really sure. But in that type of instance where cell towers were taken down, having a backup network that can communicate with everyday cell phones is highly important. And so whether that's for first responder, like FirstNet type of use cases, but also heaven forbid if we have another incident or weather issue, um, having the backup network is critical to national security. And then of course, we've talked about like PNT, like an alternative to GPS, any number of applications. And so that's I mean, when I talked about it with some of the other folks who are in the space mob, we kind of all come to the conclusion it just makes a ton of sense. That being said, I'm not, who knows if the government will take a stake, but I think the risk is there. Risk meaning to the upside, right? And I think you're seeing that in a lot of the critical mineral companies, next generation nuclear power development companies. I mean, any number of industries, right? And so I think for space, this definitely holds true. Because again, if you take a step back and look at what the U.S. views as critical strategically and where it wants to lead, and an area where China is not at parity yet, but pretty close, that's space, and that's space communications, that's observation, that's launch, that's pretty much everything in the sector. And so I think that's why whether you have these massive headlines of the government taking stakes in the companies or giving them cheap loans, there's a whole host of things that can transpire. And I think as a shareholder, that's something that we should be ready for in case it does happen. And I think if you're short, you should be ready for that too, because it can be career ending. I think if we were to walk in and I did a poll, so let me just see what the results are. I did a poll earlier today. If we saw that Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal run a story that the U.S. government is considering a 5 to 10% passive equity investment (AST) where the stock or shares trade, it looks like, and I guess this is just people's over enthusiasm, but maybe not. I think the number of highest votes went to $200 or $150, which is basically doubling of the stock, which perhaps it won't happen overnight. And of course, if it's a Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal article, that means it hasn't happened yet. But if you look at like LAC or TMQ, USAR, MP, once there's rumors out there, and then once they become reality, in those instances, the stocks doubled or tripled. And I don't know what the short interest dynamics were there, but I'm sure that had quite a bit to do with it as well. But yeah, I think it the probability is higher than the market thinks, and I personally would view it positively. I know some people don't view it as positively or think it might impact our ability to do deals around the world, but I personally don't think so. As long as it's a passive stake, it doesn't come with board seats or anything like that. And as we've seen with some of these other investments, there really isn't much in terms of strings attached. And I think, as I mentioned before, initially it was kind of a focus around critical minerals and things like that. But then I think the strategic investment in Intel kind of changed the game, where it's like, okay, these guys are looking beyond just natural resources, which obviously are risky and require a lot of capital to develop and, have to get through regulatory hoops. But now they're thinking like much more broadly. They're going above just inputs, but they're going to industries that are strategic. And so, I think, again, I think the potential is there, and something that space mobile investors should calibrate towards. And candidly, I think people should welcome that. Because imagine like you have AT&T, Vodafone, Google, American Tower, and of course Verizon last week. I talked about the dynamics where all these companies make investments and signing up strategic partnerships just validates what we're doing. And critically, for Verizon to announce their the definitive commercial agreement last week basically re-underwrites the entire thesis around AST space bubble, because they've obviously looked at test results. They've been working closely together. They also, since I guess the end of May last year. I'm sure they've continued to talk to Starlink, and I'm sure Starlink representatives have gone to Verizon and said, "Hey, you guys should sign with us, and here's all the reasons. Look at all this cool stuff we're doing." But even after all that, Verizon still signed a different agreement with us and stuck with us, which I think is a big, huge like validation for us. So similarly, if the US takes a 5 to 10% stake in a company after the SGA, DIU, any number of organizations who, we have 6 military contracts with the US government. After all that testing and the results that have stemmed from that, for the US government to say, "Hey, this company is critical, we're going to take a stake," that would just be a mind-blowing like validation, I think, for this company. And so, yeah, it would be a big deal. And I think the market is underestimating that risk, and I think it's a decent probability. And if we do, I mean, no one knows for sure, but I feel like the company is pretty confident, and we certainly are. If we do get a Golden Dome award, then I think basically all options are on the table, right? Like if the company gets Golden Dome, or a few other big military contracts, then at that point, I would think the probability of a potential passive stake in the company become much, much higher, if not perhaps announced at the same time. But anyway, I've been rambling. I'm going to pause there. Let me just take a look and see if there's any comments down here. A bit Ergol, I do not understand how that reduces the cost of capital. They will buy it from the market, right? Or they take stage by paying premium to AST, very less solution. What I mean by reducing the cost of capital is that, let's say the US government, let's for shits and giggles, let's give the US government a 10% discount. Let's say they buy AST Mobile shares at $80, right? And then AST Space Mobile, so we gave them a little sweetheart deal. We sold them stock at a 10% discount, and then AST Space Mobile stock price, just to make it simple, doubles. It doubles in price to 180. Well, in essence, your cost of capital has gone down, right? Because then instead of raising additional equity capital, if that's where you decide to go, instead of raising it at that 90, you're starting to raise equity capital at 180. And so dilution is much, much less, right? And the reason why that was accomplished is that the US government has taken a stake in your company, and they've given you, the ultimate validation. They're saying your tech works, you're important to us, you're critical. If you have issues in the future, we're backing you from a regulatory standpoint. Perhaps you're going to get some favorable treatments, whatever it is, right? But because all that is encapsulated into $180 stock price, and let's say the stock continues to stay at 180, and you're able to raise, you raise a few $100 million at 180, that means your cost of capital has been cut in half because the stock price has doubled. So at least from an equity perspective, not debt, but equity, your cost of capital has been cut in half. So that's what I mean by that. Let's see. I get taking an equity stake in almost entirely commercial business, but if AST gets billions from US contract, doesn't that give them a vote of confidence and reduce cost of capital, et cetera? Why would there be a need for equity stake on top of contracts? That's a very good point. The US government could just give us a bunch of contracts, and the stock price appreciates and everyone's happy. We've been given a de facto vote of confidence. However, to your question, Darket, this administration works differently. So they also are commercially interested. And so what you've seen the Trump administration do is take equity stakes, because they know that by doing so, those stock prices of said companies are going to double or triple. Then they're able to go to, their constituents, the U.S. population, and say, "Hey, look, not only did we give government money to these various companies through contracts, but we actually were smart enough to take an equity stake, and we actually made back like a decent amount of that money." Or and so I think part of it stems from just it's a political win for politicians, right? Like they were savvy enough. Not only did we help foster this industry, but we took an equity stake and we made a bunch of money. I mean, imagine like the bureaucrats who gave Tesla the original loans, right? If they forced Elon Musk to give them 10% of the company, that would have been like the best trade ever for the US government, because that obviously would be worth way more than the money that they loaned to Tesla. And so I think that's where, from a government's perspective, like why they would take an equity stake. Also, the optics of it, that if the government is willing to take equity risk on a company, it means that they see the potential is there, and they're probably implicitly going to do what they can to protect that equity stake, right? And so there's like some additional tangible, meaty represent what that, in terms of what that means or represents to the market. It's just a bit more than just a government contract, right? And so it's like, oh, the government has skin in the game, and they actually think there's upside here. Which I think, obviously there's companies out there that get government contracts and people are skeptical and they stay short the company, but it's like a totally different animal when the government, in this instance, taking a strategic stake, not taking a stake because of a company's getting, in failure or something, but taking an equity stake because they believe in the company. The signaling, I think, is just much more powerful, in addition to, the financial contracts or awards that are given. Kelly Gromley, I think we have 8 government contracts now. Okay, I might be behind on this. Not 6, maybe it's 8. Let's see. Let's see here. Someone's claiming that the hackers, or the potential hackers of during the UN meeting, were likely Chinese actors who are trying to disrupt US MNO networks. Yeah, I mean, I don't personally know. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, it just underscores the importance of having resiliency and a failover network, which is what AST Space Mobile is going to provide. Let's see. $90 currently before the BB2 launch cadence seems pleasantly beyond what most people envisioned. Where does this put stock price guesstimates at once launches happen, say mid-2026? This is from Thomas Ashford. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I'm not really sure. As I've mentioned before, I think, and our esteemed friend Professor Mack has talked about as well. I think the market, with stock where it is now, and over the last, call it 2 or 3 weeks, there has been some short covering, but it does seem that professional money managers, there does seem to be a re-rating of sorts where people are beginning to recognize them. And this is what Brian O'Connor, Kook, Piranha Capital has talked about, and I've talked about as well, is that we're kind of now at the point in the story where it's not a matter of if it's going to happen or is there risk, but it's more like inevitability, right? Like, it's going to happen. Like, the constellation is going to go up there and service is going to happen. Now, we might be wrong by a few months or perhaps even a few quarters because this stuff is really hard, but it's going to happen. And so I think the market is starting to price the fact that this is going to happen. The opportunity is huge. And so once that's kind of the base case, then how does the market discount that, right? Like, is the market, for the skeptics and shorts, are like, hey, you should be looking at the last 12 months financials. The historic financials basically say, like, this company hasn't generated anything. But as Ryan O'Connor famously pointed out, like, when they were building the Alaska pipeline, no one was valuing it off of the existing financial capacity, which was zero. Like, they were valuing it off of future cash flows, right? And so it's not as if people built the pipeline and then the day they turned on the oil, that was like, hey, okay, now we can value the company because it's carrying oil now. And so in same regards for AST, it's the question is, like, are people going to value the company in this potential? Are they discounting it based off of 2026, 2027, 2028? And when you get to those out years, the numbers become really massive. Even if you haircut them significantly, right? Like, we're talking about minimal penetration rates into subscriber bases of 50 or more MNOs. And so similarly for SpaceX, when you looked at the development of the launch capacity or launch vehicles, and then of course Starlink, it's not as if people were pricing or valuing SpaceX off of what they were doing at that point in time when the company was worth, 10 billion, 20 billion, 40, 50, 100. They were valuing it based off of the potential, where they would eventually get to, which it took much longer than people had expected, and for the company expected. I mean, SpaceX, famously, when Elon Musk had talked about going to Mars, those initial slides, I believe, showed that Starship was going to be landing on Mars sometime in 2022. Well, guess what? We're in 2025, and we're still quite a long ways away from that becoming a reality. That said, SpaceX is now worth close to $500 billion. And the skeptics will say, well, if you value it based off of current year revenues and profitability, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, Sherlock, no one is valuing Starlink or SpaceX based off of this year's financials. They're basing off of what the potential the company can do in 2 to 3 years, right? And so the funny thing about like rates, an interest rate environment where rates are really low and the discount rate is low as a result, and perhaps there's more liquidities swashing around the market and people are becoming more enthusiastic about the prospects of any number of sectors, they start to discount further out. Like, okay, I'm going to, instead of looking at 2026 or 2027, I'm going to start looking at 2028 numbers. And so, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think, I do think we have the ability to get to, north of 100, actually relatively sooner, because going back to excitement around the launch campaign, now we're going to be launching satellites every, once that starts, it'll be a payload every 1.5 months on average. And so there's going to be something tangible for investors to get their arms around. And obviously once those satellites start opening up and people start underwriting the economics for each satellite, then I think you're going to see this continued unlocking of valuation and what that means. And I mean, God, like if we get Golden Dome or some of these other military contracts, then that opens up a whole, like a true another segment. We have 3 verticals: the commercial business with MNOs, the government business with first responder networks, and then of course defense. But if you were to get a few $100 million or whatever it is for Golden Dome, which then can grow into much bigger numbers, what does that mean? And how do you value that piece of the business? And so, let me just take a look here. Our current market cap is 33 billion, and perhaps I think maybe the market was discounting or rewriting the valuation partially because of, as we all know, Legato that got bankruptcy approval not long ago. This was just a few weeks ago, and whether you value Legato at 15 or 20 billion dollars, depends on obviously the economics they're able to extract from that spectrum, which I think is going to be very high. And so if you had a residual from that, if you take out that piece of what that spectrum was worth commercially deployed, then you've got 10, 15 billion of equity left. That's built into AC Space Mobile's stock price. Like, how big is the Golden Dome business? Like, if that generates a few $100 million a year, what is that worth? Or if we truly are able to provide a secondary backup to GPS for PNT services, like that in of itself is a few $100 million a year. And then if you're able to generate a few $1 billion a year in subscriber revenues, which are highly recurring, from mobile subscribers and have very high margins because we don't have loaded costs like customer support, service, acquisition costs. We don't have any of these things. Our MNO partners are going to bear all that. So what is that worth? And so I think it's a long-winded answer to say, the stock, mid 2026, I could easily see it double from here, right? Could it, or possibly even higher, or maybe it will be a little bit higher from here. But it's hard to kind of triangulate because I think it really depends on how quickly the market understands the opportunity. And that said, we've been very fortunate that the market is starting to understand and is starting to get priced in, as they were to say, which some people say, some folks out there they think everything's priced in, but in reality, I think that's too simplistic of an answer. But anyway, yeah, that's my answer. Let's see here. Just looking through some of these questions. Interesting. Somebody, Dylan here, asked Grog, what do you estimate the odds of the U.S. taking a passive stake in ASTS to be? This is what Grog said. Based on current partnerships, 8 with the DoD, SDA, DIU, and precedents like U.S. stakes in Intel or MP Materials, a passive stake in AST is plausible for strategic reasons like network resiliency. I agree with that. However, no confirmed plans exist. I'd estimate the odds at 10 to 20% with high uncertainty. High uncertainty. Okay. So yeah, I think I would err on higher probability. I'd put that more at 20%. And depending on how some of these contracts unfold, that probability goes even higher. But it is kind of cool to see that Grok agrees to some extent. So anyway, that's kind of it. Oh, I see some people who I've never seen before asking to come up. So I will bring up a few people and let's see what they have to say. Let's bring up Jack Capital here. Hello, Jack. Are you there? You're on mute. Jack Capital. Jack, you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello? Okay. No, I was curious I've been a long time follower of your page and you made me a bunch of money. But anyway, thank you for that. But what is your sort of ultra long term, like what do you think this company becomes? Like your super long term thesis, is this going to be sort of like equal in size? I'm not asking for specifics, but are you seeing
Sure.
it as an equal in size as SpaceX, Starlink, or just your like 10-year, 20-year, what you see for this company?
Yeah, I think over the long run, AST, I think the key thing for people to understand is this company has the potential to be the largest wireless carrier in the world with, with over 1 billion subscribers. I mean, that's the opportunity, right? And so what is that worth? It could be worth 10x, the market cap it is today, which would put it at $320 billion, right? Or it could be more than that. And so what are people willing to pay for that? And so that's what I think the long-term potential is. Now, does it take 10 years to get there, 15 years? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how long that will take, but I think that's what the opportunity is. And so for a company like this, where you have an install base of mobile phones that can be lit up and service be provided through MNO partnerships, of course, to subscribers, whether that's on an ongoing basis or a one-off basis. Yeah, the potential is huge. I don't think that there's been any other businesses quite like it. I think Piranha, who's down below, has talked about Netflix growing to a few 100 million subscribers, everyone paying $15 a month. Perhaps that's kind of a similar example, but I think that's the opportunity where this company has so much white space and runway, and it's not just, for the regular observer, they just think about consumer applications, but they don't think about defense or government. And so, I mean, just look at Netflix, the market cap is $518 billion. So yeah, I think those are the types of numbers that eventually we could, this company could get to. That's how I think about long term.
Got it. Thanks for that. And just one last question, just
Yeah.
regarding this potential U.S. government stake. Do you think that, so let's just make an assumption that if U.S. does acquire that 5 to 10% stake that we've been talking about, does that materially affect, and this is just, I guess, very crazy thinking, but does that materially affect acquisition odds from something like an Apple, etc., if they see the U.S. government acquiring, taking a little stake? And then just what are your thoughts on that?
It depends. If the acquirer is friendly to the US and the US is okay with it, then I don't think that would impact it. But then I think AST is very unique in that it does have a high amount of strategic value, but the value is also remaining neutral. And what I mean by that is if Apple acquires it, then perhaps like Google will feel threatened and maybe they won't play as nice. And that's why, for example, the company has its dual class ownership where Bell controls the company. They did that to keep the possibility of some interloper buying shares in the company and forcing, whether it's a hedge fund or maybe another corporation, like forcing the company into a sale. But I think for a company like Apple, I think the U.S. government would probably view them positively and allow that to go through. But I think, a foreign entity, if you had aspirations that perhaps a foreign buyer might be able to buy the company, that would certainly be off the table if the U.S. took a stake. But I do think the highest value and use case for the company is not to be owned by Google or Facebook or Meta or Amazon or Apple. I think it's to remain independent because the nature of what the company is doing, which is serving as many MNOs as possible and as many companies like Microsoft, Amazon. I mean, all these companies need connectivity. I think remaining neutral is going to be important. Now, that doesn't preclude them from taking strategic stakes, which is what they've done in the past, right? American Tower, Google, Verizon, Vodafone, AT&T have all taken investment stakes, Rakuten, and that's okay as long as there's no majority owner or someone who has undue influence. And so that's why I've always poo-pooed the idea of the company ever selling, because the real value is remaining independent and serving everybody. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Thanks for that. That's my final question. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks for coming up. You see, there's Mateo Jones. I'm going to bring him up. Okay. Let's see. Maybe it's not working. All right. Well, I think they are not going to come up. They're having connection issues. But actually, I'm not looking at the clock. It's 2:17. I actually have to hop soon. We got to go pick up the kids. There's no school today in New York, so there's various camps going on. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I hope this was helpful and spurred some, thought for everyone. Something to think about, which is the fact that I do think the company itself is highly strategic and important to network resiliency, communications, both on the consumer side, but government and military side. And so I think as we follow the development and focus of U.S. government on space as an important sector, I do think the possibility and probability of the U.S. taking stakes, and again, that doesn't necessarily just mean equity. It could also mean loans, quasi-government loans, whatever it is. Right? But I do think perhaps we should be surprised, like when some of these Golden Dome contracts awards go out. And again, this is partially to secure U.S. interests as well. I mean, if you're going to dole out a large award to a company that still is pre-revenue and is on the cusp of commercialization, but you want to make sure that they're going to make it and you have their complete attention to focus. Not only do you dole out a big award, but I think perhaps you take a stake in the company as well. And so, we'll see in the coming weeks. I do, unfortunately, the government shutdown, I think it's delayed awards, but we should be learning about some of these awards, whether it's related to Golden Dome or some of these other contracts. We should start seeing those in the coming weeks and months. And it's something to think about. And I bet we will see the U.S. government take additional stakes in other sectors. And so as an investment thing, I think it's something to be aware of. And, whether you're speculating on some companies that seem like they should be critical to U.S. interests and perhaps, they might be good candidates. That's an emerging theme that I think probably everybody is spending extra time trying to think through the next companies that might get a round of investment and what second and third order effects are. I mean, you name it. But anyway, I hope this was helpful, and we'll talk again soon. I'm sure there's going to be more news, which I expect. I've mentioned this before. There's some additional commercial agreements that could come to fruition. I think Bell Canada is probably on the top of the list, Saudi Telecom, a few others, but any day now, which, it's an exciting time to be an investor. Anyway, I'll cut it there, and we'll do this again. Maybe there'll be some news today, tomorrow, this week, and I'll have to run another space. But so thanks again, everyone, for joining. I hope it was helpful, and until next time, take care.
Creatures of my dreams rise up and dance with me. Now and forever, I will
Thanks for listening to the AST Space Mover podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest news about AST Space Mover, make sure to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
We're doing something very, very big. And I think with this technology, we can really affect a billion lives. AST Space Mover is the only company that has proven technology to deliver cellular broadband connectivity directly from space to your everyday smartphone. People will just basically turn their phone and be seamless, regardless of where you are. We don't want the user even to know that it's connected by satellite. Our role is to bring this into reality, always in partnership with the MNOs.
Listen. Waffles.